Next, Mr. Chameleon and the shocking marriage murder case. Tonight, we again present the famous Mr. Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters in his famous cases of crime and murder, brought to you by the makers of genuine Bayer aspirin. Mr. Chameleon, as you know, is the famous and dreaded detective who frequently uses a disguise to track down a killer, a disguise which at all times is recognized by the audience. Tonight, we give you Mr. Chameleon in the shocking marriage murder case. In the living room of a magnificently furnished apartment at the fashionable May Park Apartment Hotel, Helen Steele seems impervious to the beauty of her surroundings. In fact, her face, marked with lines of unhappiness, makes her look even older than her 45 years. And her brother, Peter Harris, sits watching her anxiously as she restlessly paces about. And then he says to her,
Helen, for heaven's sake, don't take it so seriously. You and Barney were divorced. The divorce was granted yesterday. But you mustn't behave as if your life was ended.
As you pointed out, Peter, the divorce was granted yesterday. Can't you allow me 24 hours for grieving?
Well, I wouldn't grieve too long. At least, Helen, there isn't any scandal attached to your divorce. No correspondent or anything like that.
Peter, I know the only reason Barney asked me for a divorce was because there must be some woman in the case. And I've always wondered who that woman is.
But that's all water over the dam, Helen. Forget about who the woman is who took your husband away from you, if there is one. And you're not even sure that there is one.
Oh, that must be Sandra. Sandra?
Yes, Helen.
Hello, darling. Peter and I were just discussing the divorce.
And I was telling my dear sister and your loving stepmother to forget it.
Sandra's a woman, Peter. She'll agree with me, I'm sure, that it's not easy to forget a marriage that was happy for so long. Oh, I was happy with your father, Sandra. Of course I was. But after his death, I was very lonely. Until I met Barney Steele.
And now you've lost Barney, too.
Yes, Sandra. And I want to know what woman took him away from me.
I did, Helen.
You did?
Is this a joke, Sandra?
No, Peter. Barney and I have been in love for a year.
I don't believe it. I can't believe it. Sandra, you're my daughter.
Your stepdaughter, Helen. You never took the place of my real mother. That's why I had no compunction about stealing your husband away from you.
Sandra!
I can't believe it. Barney can't love you, Sandra.
No? We were married last night, Helen. Just a few hours after the divorce was granted.
No.
And you never guessed Barney and I were in love. You never suspected. Barney and I kept it a secret for months. We were very clever, weren't we? We fooled you, Helen. You who took my own father away from me.
That's enough, Sandra.
Get out of here, you wretched girl. Get out, you hear me?
I'm not deaf, Helen. And I'm only too glad to leave. But if you ever want to find your ex-husband and me, you won't have far to go. We've taken the penthouse.
In this building?
You didn't.
Oh, yes, we did, my dear Helen. So if you don't look us up, we're almost sure to meet in the elevator anyway.
The following morning at Central Police Headquarters, Mr. Chameleon, the great detective, has been summoned to the office of the Commissioner of Police, who is saying to him,
Here are the facts of the case, Chameleon. Sandra Steele was found stabbed to death this morning in the bedroom of the penthouse at the May Park Hotel. Her husband, Barney Steele, was practically incoherent when he talked to us, so we weren't able to get any details. That's your job and Detective Dave Arnold's.
There's one interesting detail that I know of, Commissioner. Newspapers have been full of Barney Steele's recent divorce and his second marriage. Did you know that on the very day of the divorce that he married his ex-wife's stepdaughter?
What?
Yes, shocking marriage, tabloids' delight. Barney Steele's first wife, Helen, was formerly married to Sandra's father, William Eastman.
William Eastman, the coal magnate?
Yes, that's the one. And William Eastman, Commissioner, left a fortune to his daughter, Sandra, who this morning lies murdered.
She sounds like quite a girl, Chameleon. Deliberately stealing her stepmother's husband.
Yes. And that inheritance. It rings a bell somehow. Let me call Dave Arnold. Dave?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. All set for the Sandra Steele murder case?
Yes, Dave. And I want you to look up the will of Sandra's father, William Eastman, and the fortune that he left to his daughter. Get a copy of it from the probate court and bring it to me at Barney Steele's penthouse, where I'm going now.
And a little later, we find Mr. Chameleon in the luxurious penthouse of Barney Steele. And he is talking to the greatly overwrought Barney Steele and saying,
Mr. Steele, let me get this straight. You awoke this morning to find your bride, Sandra, stabbed to death in the bed next to yours.
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. I know it sounds incredible that I should have been sleeping in the same room and yet never hear a sound. But I didn't. I'd been drinking quite heavily last night, and I slept as if I were drugged. I've no idea what happened.
Did you have a headache this morning?
Yes, a terrible headache.
Well, it's quite possible, Mr. Steele, that whoever murdered your young bride held a handkerchief soaked in chloroform over your face while you were sleeping.
Do you think that's possible? But who could have done such a thing? Who'd want to kill Sandra? She was so young, so lovely.
Mr. Steele, isn't it true that your bride, Sandra, was the stepdaughter of your former wife? That you married Sandra only a few hours after you received your divorce?
Mr. Chameleon, surely you don't think my ex-wife, Helen... Oh, no, Helen wouldn't be capable of murdering her own stepdaughter.
Well, your marriage to her stepdaughter must have been a frightful shock.
I know. Poor Helen didn't want to divorce me, but she couldn't have murdered Sandra, Mr. Chameleon.
You don't really sound convinced, though you're making a very good try. Mr. Steele, when did Sandra last see her stepmother?
Yesterday afternoon. She saw Helen and Peter, Helen's brother, Peter Harris, who probably didn't make things easier.
Well, you sound as if you didn't like Peter Harris.
The man's a parasite. He's never worked in his life, and he's a hopeless gambler. He was always asking Helen or me for money, or Sandra. Oh, but he's no murderer either.
Mr. Steele, no one is a murderer until they commit a murder. If Peter Harris cared for his sister Helen, he... Well, what did they say to your wife, Sandra?
I'm afraid it was a pretty dreadful scene, Mr. Chameleon. Sandra said that her stepmother, Helen, was extremely bitter. But Helen
I know, your ex-wife is no murderer. Mr. Steele, where does she live?
Helen? On the 15th floor, 2 floors below us.
Do you mean that your ex-wife and her brother live in this very building? There would have been a chance of running into each other.
Yes. I suppose you think that was rather hard on Helen.
It's a little. Oh, I'll go to the door, Mr. Steele. That's probably my assistant, Detective Dave Arnold. If it is, we shall go directly to see your ex-wife, Helen, who still lived so close to you and your young bride.
And so, a few minutes later, we find Mr. Chameleon descending the stairs with Detective Dave Arnold. And Mr. Chameleon is saying,
There, you see, Dave, what a simple matter it would have been for Helen, the ex-Mrs. Steele, to have come up these stairs, or her brother, Peter Harris. No elevator man would have seen them. No one.
Well, here's the 15th floor, Mr. Chameleon. And that's Helen Steele's apartment over there.
Before we go in, let me take one more look at that will. One left by the murdered Sandra's father.
It's quite a will, Mr. Chameleon.
My entire career, Dave, I've never seen a stranger one. Sandra's father left his entire fortune to Sandra. Provision, if she should die before being married, would all go to her stepmother, Helen.
Yeah, but Sandra did marry. She married her stepmother's ex-husband.
Yes, exactly. If Sandra married and had children, the fortune would go to them on her death. Then no children, 1/2 the fortune would go to Helen, and the other half to Sandra's husband.
So, now that Sandra's dead, Helen and her ex-husband Barney share the fortune.
Kind of peculiar, isn't it, Dave?
You don't think Helen and Barney were working together and murdered Sandra so they could split the money?
Anything's possible, Dave. But, doesn't seem quite reasonable that a man like Barney Steele would marry a young girl and murder her within one day.
So that leaves his ex-wife, Helen Steele.
And her brother, Peter Harris. But, let's go in. I must say, I'm curious to see them.
Yes?
Mr. Harris? Peter Harris?
Correct.
I'm Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters. This is my assistant, Detective Dave Arnold.
Oh, you've come about Sandra, haven't you? My sister Helen is too shocked to be able to give you a statement.
I'm not a newspaper man looking for a statement, Mr. Harris. I'm a detective who's been assigned to a murder case.
We want to talk to both you and your sister, Mr. Harris, so don't try to put us off.
Very well, come in. As I say, this has been a great shock to Helen, Mr. Chameleon. We can't understand why Barney would do such a thing.
You believe that your ex-brother-in-law, Barney Steele, murdered his young bride of a day?
Well, what else can I believe? He was in the same room with her.
That proves nothing, Mr. Harris.
It must prove something. Here's Helen now. Helen, this is Mr. Chameleon, the detective, and also Detective Arnold. They've come about Sandra.
How do you do, Mr. Chameleon? What can I do for you?
Answer a few rather personal questions, Mrs. Steele.
Gladly. I'll tell you honestly, I was very bitter against my stepdaughter, Sandra.
I should think you would be, Mrs. Steele, when she married your ex-husband the very day that you and he were divorced.
Yes. But now it seems tragic that such a young girl should be dead.
And, stabbed to death, Mrs. Steele.
Yes, stabbed to death.
Mrs. Steele, didn't you realize that your stepdaughter Sandra was having a love affair with your then-husband?
Certainly not.
I'm asking your sister, Mr. Harris.
No, Mr. Chameleon. I had no idea. The whole thing came as a complete surprise.
Do you mean to say that the three of you were living in this apartment?
The four of us, with my brother, Peter.
Well, the four of you, then. You saw each other every day. Yet you never dreamed that there was anything at all between your stepdaughter and your husband?
No. And that shows how clever Barney was, Mr. Chameleon. He's a very clever man. You mustn't let him fool you.
I'm not as easily fooled as you seem to think, Mr. Harris. By the way, what is your profession?
My profession?
Yes, you must have one.
Well, I've sort of dabbled in this and that.
Does your sister Helen Steele support you?
Mr. Chameleon.
I'm sorry, but it's necessary for me to ask these questions.
Mr. Chameleon, if my brother needs money, naturally I let him have it. He'd do the same for me. But what are you driving at? Why do you hint that we knew of the love affair between Sandra and Barney?
Mrs. Steele, who stood to benefit financially from Sandra's death?
I beg your pardon.
Under the terms of the will of your first husband, Sandra's father, who gets the fortune that he left her?
Well, really,
Now, Mrs. Steele, please don't say that you don't know. I've seen the will. You approved that will, so you certainly know its contents.
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. Barney Steele and I share my stepdaughter Sandra's fortune.
Now, wait a minute, Mr. Chameleon.
Yes, Mr. Harris?
Are you insinuating that my sister and I promoted the marriage between Barney and Sandra and then killed her so we'd get half a fortune?
That, Mr. Harris, is quite an insinuation.
Yes, it is, but that's what you think, isn't it?
At this point, I'm simply collecting facts. Mrs. Steele, I may want to see you later.
I'll be here, Mr. Chameleon. And I didn't kill Sandra.
I haven't said you did, Mrs. Steele. Good day. Come along, Dave. Dave, I have a hunch that Peter Harris is going to follow us.
Oh, Mr. Chameleon, please, just a second.
You called the shot that time, Mr. Chameleon.
Mr. Chameleon, there's something I'd like to say about Barney Steele that I didn't want my sister Helen to hear.
What is it, Mr. Harris?
Just a suggestion, Mr. Chameleon. I suggest you look up a girl named Kitty Powers and ask my charming ex-brother-in-law whether he ever heard of her.
Mr. Chameleon and the shocking marriage murder case continue in just a moment. When you have a cold, you need Bayer aspirin. You need it because it's important to you that you get quick relief from the headachy, feverish feeling, and the muscular aches and pains that almost always accompany a cold. And because Bayer aspirin gives you this important relief, it should be taken at the first sign of a cold before you do anything else. Regardless of what you do to stop or shorten a cold, we believe your own doctor will tell you that this is sound advice. And it's advice you can follow with confidence, for Bayer aspirin is used by millions to treat these distressing symptoms. It provides amazingly fast relief, makes you feel better, because it's ready to go to work in 2 seconds. And its single active ingredient is so gentle to the system that doctors prescribe it even for small children. That's why it's been used by millions of normal people without ill effect. So at the first sign of a cold, before you do anything else, take Bayer aspirin. When you buy, ask for Bayer aspirin, not just for aspirin alone. Get the 100-tablet bottle and you get Bayer aspirin tablets for less than a penny apiece. Now back to Mr. Chameleon and the shocking marriage murder case. When young Sandra Steele is stabbed to death, Mr. Chameleon discovers that her marriage to Barney Steele was a strangely tangled affair emotionally. For Sandra and Barney had been married on the very day of his divorce from Sandra's stepmother, Helen Steele. And now in his office at Central Police Headquarters, Mr. Chameleon is talking to Barney Steele and saying,
Mr. Steele, as you must know, you and your ex-wife Helen share in your bride Sandra's fortune. That was one of the terms of her father's will.
So you found that out, did you, Mr. Chameleon?
Mm-hmm.
I thought you would. But you mustn't let it influence you. My ex-wife Helen couldn't possibly have murdered Sandra, her own stepdaughter.
Are you, afraid that she did? Is that why you're so vehement about it?
No.
I presume that you still have some affection for your ex-wife Helen, and, she must have hated Sandra for stealing you away from her. Emotion plus greed. 2 very strong motives, Mr. Steele.
Mr. Chameleon, if anyone is the victim of greed, it's Helen's brother, Peter Harris. He's a parasite. A completely cold-blooded parasite.
Well, also, he may have had some feeling for his sister, who was treated pretty shabbily by her stepdaughter, Sandra, and by you. Mr. Steele, do you know a Kitty Powers?
Who?
Kitty Powers, a nightclub habitué, and I understand pretty much of a gold digger.
Yes, I know her. Casually.
Casually, Mr. Steele. I wonder if she'd agree. Let's find out, shall we? Miss Powers.
Mr. Chameleon.
Miss Powers, will you come in here, please?
Certainly, Mr. Chameleon. Hello, Barney.
Kitty, what are you doing here?
I came by invitation, darling. Mr. Chameleon's invitation. Though how he found out about us, I don't know.
Mr. Steele, do you still claim that you know Miss Powers casually? Well, do you?
Mr. Chameleon, I can answer that better than Barney. We were good friends once, but it came to an end when Barney fell in love with his wife's stepdaughter, Sandra.
Nevertheless, he was deceiving his wife, Helen, wasn't he? Even before he fell in love with Sandra. Must have been pretty hard for Helen to take.
It was enough to make any woman blow her top.
No, Mr. Chameleon, that's not so. Whatever the provocation, Helen didn't commit murder.
If you say that again, I may believe that she did, Mr. Steele. Though, of course, Miss Powers here had provocation, too.
Me? You think I could have murdered Sandra?
You were in love with Barney Steele, weren't you, Miss Powers?
Listen, Mr. Chameleon, I could tell you plenty.
Kitty.
But I won't. Let bygones be bygones is my motto.
Miss Powers, if you have anything of importance to tell me...
I haven't. And all the cops in the world can't make me say I have.
Very well, Miss Powers, but don't forget you are making yourself look extremely suspect. Chameleon speaking.
Mr. Chameleon, Dave Arnold.
Yes, Dave.
There's been trouble at Helen Steele's.
Well, what kind of trouble?
Well, no one knows exactly, but her neighbors heard quarreling and then a shot. It looks as if she tried to kill herself.
I'll be right up, Dave. Meet you in 10 minutes. Mr. Steele, you and Miss Powers may go for now, but I may have plenty to say to you later.
What was that phone call, Mr. Chameleon? I have a right to know. It was my wife who was murdered.
Your last wife, Mr. Steele, and I must say that your tangled marital affairs are certainly beginning to pay off in violence.
And a few minutes later, we find Mr. Chameleon back at Helen Steele's expensive apartment. And he is saying to Peter Harris, who stands beside his weeping sister,
Mr. Harris, I must insist on knowing what happened here. Did you and your sister quarrel?
We had a slight disagreement, Mr. Chameleon.
Yes, so slight that the neighbors heard you. And they also heard a shot.
Mr. Chameleon, this was something personal between Peter and myself.
Well, perhaps. But it had some bearing upon your stepdaughter Sandra Steele's murder. And what about the shot?
People imagined it. It was a car backfiring.
Oh, really, Mr. Harris? Why are you glancing at that desk so nervously? Is that where you or your sister keep a gun? Let's have a look, shall we?
Mr. Chameleon, please.
Keep away from that desk.
No. As I thought, a revolver. With one chamber empty. Who threatened whom?
We were out of our minds, that's all, Mr. Chameleon. Do you blame us? It's all been too much. Barney leaving me, marrying my stepdaughter Sandra, and then Sandra's murder.
So you wanted to kill yourself, Mrs. Steele?
Oh, not really. The gun went off unexpectedly.
And I suppose you don't believe that either, Mr. Chameleon.
At the moment, Mr. Harris, I can only take your word for it. Mrs. Steele, you won't tell me what you were quarreling about?
We weren't quarreling. It was only a fit of nerves.
Very well. But this is exactly the way you'd behave if you had conspired together to commit some evil deed.
Mr. Chameleon...
Now tell me the truth, Mrs. Steele, the truth.
I can't. I mean, I already have. It was just a senseless squabble. My brother Peter and I were both upset.
All right. Good day.
Have you finished with us?
For the present, Peter. Okay, Dave, let's go.
What do you make of that, Mr. Chameleon? You think Helen Steele really tried to kill herself because she's guilty of murdering Sandra Steele, her stepdaughter?
Possibly, Dave. Or she may suspect her brother of the murder, and he may have tried to kill her. And when confronted by the police, they stick together.
And look at Barney Steele. He benefits financially by his young bride's death.
Mm-hmm. Yet it still seems unreasonable that a man would murder his bride despite the presence of his former girlfriend, Kitty Powers. You know, Dave, I've a feeling that Sandra's murder was a result of a combination of greed and emotion. Let's concentrate on the financial end first, Dave.
Well, what do you mean, Mr. Chameleon?
I want to find out who needed money the most. I'm going to assume the disguise of an agent for a collection agency. Hard, crooked guy named Joe Lester. And I'm going to pay a call on everyone concerned in this murder and try to find out who is most heavily in debt.
And the following day, we find Mr. Chameleon in his disguise as Joe Lester, the collector of bills. And he's approaching the penthouse of Barney Steele and saying to Dave Arnold,
Dave, if you go through that door, you'll find yourself on the terrace that runs around the penthouse on 3 sides.
Yes, sir.
Now, I'm going in the front door. Helen Steele and her brother Peter Harris should be there, too. But you wait on the terrace and come in fast if you have to.
Okay, Mr. Chameleon. Good luck.
And when Barney Steele opens the door of the penthouse, Mr. Chameleon speaks in the voice of his disguise.
How do you do, Mr. Steele? I'm Joe Lester.
Oh, yes, come in, Mr. Lester. We've been expecting you. No, I don't see why you couldn't have seen us separately.
Just a time saver, Mr. Steele, just a time saver. I knew your dead wife Sandra's estate was to be settled, and since there are several outstanding accounts against it, well, I'll go into that later. Is this Peter Harris?
It is, and just what do you want of me, young man?
Lester is the name, and for anybody who owes as much as you do, Mr. Harris, that's a strange question to ask a bill collector.
What does he owe, Mr. Lester?
Plenty, Mrs. Steele. So does Barney Steele here.
I owe money?
Yep. Peter Harris alone owes $3,000 to Guy Carlton.
Is that right, Peter?
Yes, that's right, Helen.
Oh, Peter, again? I thought you'd stop gambling. This is too much. Wasn't it enough that I had to make good those worthless checks of yours?
Helen, be still.
It's true. That's why I wanted to kill myself yesterday. You cost me every penny I own.
Helen.
That's interesting, I must say, Helen. So you needed Sandra's fortune even more than I did.
Well, you kind of needed it yourself, didn't you, Barney?
To whom do I owe money? Answer me, please, Mr. Lester.
Maybe we better discuss that privately.
You're joking, aren't you? There's no one I owe large sums to.
No?
Well, no. But if you want to discuss it privately...
Yeah, maybe we better. Excuse us, please. Now, Mr. Barney Steele, why put on an act? You know perfectly well who it is you owe money to.
So she sicked you on me, did she? I might have known she would. She even threatened to go to the district
Now,
attorney.
Mr. Steele...
The little cheat. I once thought I was in love with her. Well, she won't get her money. She can't prove I owe it to her.
If she threatened to go to the district attorney, you must have stolen it from her.
Let her prove that, too. And as for you, I'll give you a substantial bonus if you'll forget the whole thing.
Sorry, Mr. Steele, but you can't bribe a police officer.
Mr. Chameleon? You're Mr. Chameleon?
I thought there was something strange between you and Kitty Powers, something more than a love affair. That is why you killed Sandra, your bride of a day, because you desperately needed money.
No.
Kitty Powers was also the real woman in your life, and you were afraid of her, too. Afraid that she'd go to the DA.
Helen and Peter needed money as much as I did.
No, not quite. But enough for Helen Steele to believe that her worthless brother Peter was Sandra's murderer. She was terrorized and heartbroken. But she and Peter were not killers, and you were, Barney Steele, as you were also a thief, and Kitty Powers can verify that. Come along.
No, you're not taking me to jail. I'll jump off the terrace first.
Dave!
I've got him, Mr. Chameleon. No use fighting Barney Steele. There's no way you can fight against a pair of handcuffs.
That's right, Mr. Steele. I'm afraid your tangled marital affairs, which even included killing, caught up with you at last. I arrest you for the murder of your young bride, Sandra Steele.
And with these words, Mr. Chameleon concludes tonight's murder case. In response to many requests from mothers, genuine Bayer aspirin has been made available in a new children's-sized tablet. A tablet which now enables you to conveniently give your children the proper dosage as prescribed by your doctor. You see, each of these new tablets contains only half the amount of the regular-sized Bayer aspirin tablet you take. Thus, to give your child full dosage, you need use only one of these tablets. Because they are uncolored and unflavored, they cannot be mistaken for candy. And new children's-sized Bayer aspirin, like regular-sized Bayer aspirin, may be used with utmost confidence. For the fact that doctors prescribe Bayer aspirin's single active ingredient even for the smallest children shows how gentle and dependable it is. The bottle and carton are plainly marked, children's size Bayer aspirin, 30 tablets for 25 cents. Listen next Wednesday night at this same time for Mr. Chameleon, the man of many faces, in The Dusty Room Murder Case. The part of Mr. Chameleon is played by Carl Swenson, with dialogue by Marie Baumer, from the original story by Frank and Ann Hummert. Music directed by Victor Arden. Your announcer is Howard Claney.
Teeth that are really clean, free of decay breeding deposits and film, actually resist decay. That's why the only sensible way to help prevent tooth decay is to keep your teeth thoroughly clean at all times. And there's no dentifrice you can get that cleans teeth like powder. It's the best way that you can get your teeth really clean. Famous Dr. Lyon's tooth powder almost instantly helps remove the deposits and film that are breeding places for bacteria that cause tooth decay. So, to help prevent decay before it gets started, to whiten and brighten your teeth beautifully, use either regular or ammoniated Dr. Lyon's tooth powder.
Listen for Mr. Chameleon in The Dusty Room Murder Case next Wednesday night at this time. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.